Before we dive into today's interview, a quick reminder of the case at the center of this story, one that changed the course of American history and yet remains disturbingly overlooked. On May 18, 1927, in the small Michigan town of Bath, a man named Andrew Kehoe, angry over taxes and a failed election, carried out a meticulously planned bombing at Bath Consolidated School. He'd spent months wiring the building with dynamite and pyritol, an agricultural explosive. That morning, he detonated the charges, killing 38 children and 6 adults, and injuring dozens more. It remains to this day the deadliest act of school violence in U.S. history. The Bath disaster wasn't just an explosion, it was a calculated act of domestic terror long before that term even existed. And yet, its lessons were quickly buried in the collective memory of America. Author Arnie Bernstein has spent years piecing together what really happened and why the story of Bath still matters almost a century later. His book, Bath Massacre, America's First School Bombing, explores the man behind the violence, the community that endured it, and the chilling relevance this tragedy still holds today. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark city landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes to bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome to the show, Mr. Bernstein, although I know I'm supposed to call you Arnie.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I read your book cover to cover and then some, preparing for the Bath Massacre. And so first, I just want to say thank you so much for all of the in-depth research you provided. It's always interesting to me to be able to get firsthand experiences, and you were able to provide a lot of that.
Yeah, I was going to say, you spend years locked away wondering if anybody's going to read what you write. So, that's 4 years of my life in your hands. So, I really appreciate you saying that.
Well, I very much enjoyed it, but I wanted to ask you, what originally drew you to the Bath story?
I was looking for a narrative to write, trolling through the internet. And one of my favorite sites, I'm sure a lot of people know it, is Find a Grave, which has a lot of famous boneyards and interesting monuments, things like that. And I stumbled, it says something about the Bath Memorial. And I looked at it and I thought, how has this story not been written about before? That's the short version. It just gobsmacked me. I wanted to write this story.
So did the idea of the Bath Massacre resonate with you in some way, or is it just that you were curious about it?
I was curious, and it just seemed like such a fascinating thing to research. It had a really interesting story arc. I'm approaching it as I'm a narrative nonfiction writer, but I use the techniques of fiction to tell the stories. It just seemed to me it had all the elements in place that would make for a good tale.
When you learned about the Bath story, you were looking already for a story to write a book about?
Yes. And that okay. It just hit me. The moment I saw it, I said, I got to do this. This is my book.
So you've said in our earlier conversations that covering the story and visiting Bath changed you. But can you describe what ways, what you meant by that?
Yeah. Now, I just said, this is my story. But when I went to Bath, I realized this was not my story. I first had to meet, they have a museum in the local school, the local middle school, that's kind of like a dedicated wing with pictures and artifacts of the day, things like that. And there's a committee that I had to meet with. Many of them were children of survivors or that, lost uncles, aunts, things like that they never knew. And I was absolutely scared to death because I had to meet them first. Here I am, some crazy guy out of Chicago, and this is rural Michigan. Bath is about 12 to 15 miles outside of Lansing, but it looks a lot like it did in the 1920s. They don't even have a stoplight, just four-way stop sign. I like to say the Roaring Twenties roared right past Bath. So I met with these, I was so nervous. I had dinner with a friend the night before, and she said, I never saw you look so scared. It was kind of funny. We met, we talked, and then I went walking through the Memorial Park, which is across the street from the middle school. It was the site of the original school. Now, they rebuilt part of it on that site, and it was eventually torn down when it lived its normal life. But you can still see actually posts of the original school in that park. They have the cupola that was on top of the school. They have it in more or less the same space that it would have been in. Mm-hmm. Names of all the victims on bricks around it, and there's a boulder marking it as a Michigan State historical site. And things started to change in my mind. And then I went to the graveyard that was not too far from there. I think it's Pleasant Hill Cemetery. And suddenly it stopped being my book. It was their book. There's 17 kids buried there, out of the 36 that were killed. And it wasn't mine anymore. I had, a duty. I think people are given missions in this world that they don't always know what they are until long afterwards. And I realized this is my mission. I have to tell this story right. It's not for me. It's for these kids. And when you read the opening part of the book, the prologue, it's essentially my notes that I took up when I was visiting. It's just, that's all it is. I found out later, and I didn't find this out till a long time afterwards, after I left, apparently a lot of people had approached the Bath School Committee and saying, we want to do something here, we want to do something there. They, no, we don't like the way you're doing it. No, we don't like the way you're doing it. Now, it was my understanding that Michael Moore was doing Bowling for Columbine at the same time. And Flint, where he's from, Flint, Michigan, is not that far from Bath. It's maybe an hour or so drive. I was told that by a couple of people that Michael Moore is a real asshole about this. And they were just disgusted with him. And a friend of mine said, he had been like maybe a month before I came. A friend of mine said that could have been the best thing that happened to you. You could only look great in comparison, I guess. But I found out later, I asked one of the townies there, I said, what did you guys think when I first came? And he said, after you left, we said, we knew we have our guy. Didn't you tell me that? I was scared of you. And we were just laughing and laughing. I'm sort of like an honorary citizen of Bath, it seems. We're the strangest marriage you can imagine, but it works.
So when you sat down and met with that committee, did you walk out of that meeting with any different perspective than you walked in with?
Yeah, I realized, of course, as I said before, it's not my story. Initially, they did not want me to interview any of the survivors. There were maybe
really
5 or so, yeah. And they were protective of them, which makes sense. They were protective of these people. They'd been through trauma. They didn't know who I was, and I kept coming back to Bath, asking more questions, things like that. And then about a year after the fact, after that first meeting, one of the survivors, he was starting to slide into Alzheimer's. And so his daughter and I sat down with him at the kitchen table, Michelle Allen, who is now one of my best friends in the world. But we sat at the table and interviewed him and kept, prodding his memory. And I talked a little bit about this in the introduction to the second edition of the book. Couldn't remember what he had for breakfast that day, but you asked him about that day, and it was seared into his memory. It's something you just don't let go, and for good reason. He had lost his brother that day. His brother was murdered that day. And that opened the floodgates. And suddenly they said, you got to talk to this person. You got to talk to that person. There was also a filmmaker by the name of Matt Martin who was starting a documentary that is really expanded since then. He and I have worked closely together, and we've been at this 20 years or so. Hard to believe it's been that long. So he shared some information with me, some of the interviews he had done. And then they had me start interviewing people. And I got, for the first edition, I interviewed 4 people. And then after it was published, 2 other survivors contacted me, and I just, interviewed them for the record. And then University of Michigan Press and I decided it was time for a second edition. And so I added that because those 2 interviews gave a little more shading to the stories and filled things out that were kind of missing holes, I felt, in the book. One of the survivors, Josephine Cushman Vale, and she was Josephine Cushman then, and her brother Ralph was killed in the bombing. But she and I got to be really good pals. When I say really good pals, I mean really good pals. But she told me some of the goriest stuff in the book some of the really awful stuff in there is from her. And when she was telling me this, the woman was in her 90s at the time, and I said, you don't have to tell me this. I felt really bad about it. I didn't want to bring up terrible things. And then she said to me, really loud, really clear, no, I want people to know what happened. I'm not going to be here much longer. And she gave me in great detail a lot of terrible things.
And I understand what you're talking about, like you become sort of protective of their story. I definitely experienced that in true crime.
Yeah. Interesting story about Josephine. When we had the book debut, it was done for Book TV, and at the Capital City Library in Michigan, had a signing afterwards. And I looked up, And there was a long line of people, they were asking Josephine to sign their books, which was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful moment. And she wrote in them, Josephine Cushman Vale, survivor.
Wow. That must have been really special for those people. I mean, that's like holding a piece of history.
Yeah, and I mean, I thought, my God, I really done something with this book. I was, like I say, we became really good pals as a result. I told her Julia Roberts would play her in the movie, and she thought that was the funniest thing ever. She lived to be 100, and so did a lot of survivors. They lived to up into their 90s, past 100. One woman lived to 114, believe it or not. She was one of the oldest people in the country when she died. Or in the world, excuse me. She was one of the oldest people in the world when she died, Irene. And she had her marbles, too, till the end. She was driving past 100. But my feeling, and I've talked about this with a few people in Bath, is that they lived longer lives because they were living for children whose lives were cut short. It's one of the things you can't prove, but it's just kind of a feeling that they hung out a little longer because they wanted to have life for their loved ones who were gone. I mean, Josephine's brother was 7 years old, I think. Ralph was 7 when he was killed, but she never forgot him. She never forgot him.
I vividly remember Ralph in the story in your book.
Yeah, and her bringing the flowers to his grave every year at the anniversary. She was afraid nobody would do it. The tradition would be lost after she died, but family and me too do it every year. Well, every year, the Saturday closest to the commemoration of the bombing, they have it's called the School Union Luncheon or something like that, and they honor the 50th anniversary class. It's like so small town America, and I love it. I don't go to my own high school reunions, but I never want to miss this one. And then they have a candlelight vigil, the night of the official bombing itself. But I always stop by the cemetery and leave flowers for Ralph because flowers for Josephine, I think. But as long as, I can breathe, I will keep doing that. I don't want it to stop. I owe her that much.
That's really sweet and really special.
Thanks.
In one of our earlier conversations, you said something that I want to revisit because I found it really interesting. You said that you originally set out to write something in the vein of In Cold Blood, and then after meeting the people, everything shifted. I know we've covered this a little bit. Yeah,
I love In Cold Blood. You're a true crime person. Everybody loves it. I mean, the first time I read the book, I was like 15 or something, and it scared the living daylights out of me. I thought they were going to come and kill me, even though they were long dead. And I gave the book away, but I ended up getting it back, and I reread it every couple of years. It's just kind of an open secret. Capote did make up a lot of stuff that was in the book, but even so. And that was one of my models. My other model was the book The Executioner's Song by Norman Mailer about the Gary Gilmore case, who wanted the first man who had the death penalty after it was reinstated, and he wanted the death penalty. It's an epic book. I think it's Mailer's masterpiece. It's wonderful. So those were my two models. And after I finished the book and was ready to go out on lecture circuit and everything, reread it, I thought, oh my God, I really absorbed In Cold Blood, didn't I? The structure's all the same. It's always good as a writer to have a good model. But, as I said earlier, I'm different in Capote in that it was his story, and this was never my story, as I quickly found out. But it was a good model. It was a really good model.
It was a really good book.
Yeah, it really is.
I think I read it for the first time through in one night.
Really?
It was a really long night, but I read it in one night. I have a full-time day job, so I tend to have to do my research late at night, and I couldn't put it down and go to bed. So thank you for the lost sleep. It was worth it.
Definitely. Try The Executioner's Song. It's really good, and it goes fast, even though it's over 1,000 pages.
I will. So the kind of shift that you talked about sort of suggests that the book sort of ended up writing you as much as you wrote it. So did the writing of this book change you in any way? Or do you feel like you're still the same author that you were? Did it change the kinds of stories that you want to pursue or the kinds of works that you're looking to do?
Yeah, my first few books were small sort of history/guidebooks of Chicago. One was on movies, one was on the Civil War. And if you're familiar with the poet Carl Sandburg, who also did that 6-volume biography of Lincoln, he had been the film critic for the old Chicago Daily News during the 1920s. And I put that together. A lot of his pieces, he had over 3,000. I think we whittled it down to maybe 750, 1,000, which was difficult. And I added historical context regarding the movies, regarding Sandburg, regarding the period of the time. And this is 1920 Chicago. There's a lot going on. And That was published as The Movies Are. Sandberg wrote a column called The Movies Are, talking about the importance of movies in the Course Writings column. And that was a fun book to do. And God bless him, Roger Ebert wrote the foreword, he did a really beautiful job too. It's funny, I was at a dinner that was honoring Ebert a couple of years before he died. And I said to a friend of mine at the table who was an editor at the Chicago Sun-Times, which was Ebert's home, I said, Tom, there's not a person here in this room that Ebert hasn't done a favor for. And he said, you're right. He expected nothing in return. He was a sweet man and loved movies as much as Sandberg. But after that, I said, you know what? I got to write a full-blown narrative. These history guidebooks, things that are nice, and it shows I can write a narrative, but it's time for me to get onto a narrative. And, I was casting for a story. My degree is in fiction writing from Columbia College in Chicago, from the old fiction writing department. But as I said, I applied the techniques I learned there into nonfiction, as did Capote, as did Mailer. So this was my first full-blown narrative. And I don't want to say it was fun to write, but it sure was fun to write, considering how awful, it's a horrifying crime. But it made me dig deep into the characters, into the story, into the research. I've been told that I I over-research sometimes. I think every nonfiction writer does that. It's funny. I ended a book once. I said, I can give you 100,000 words. And my editor said, no, you are contracted for 80,000. If you give me 100,000, I will throw it right back at you. All right. We compromised. I did 85. But things happen. There were so many puzzles and things to figure out and a timeline. Now, of course, the day of the bombing, there's no timeline. It was chaotic. And so what I did was just kind of do that in short paragraph bursts, hoping to capture the chaos of the day and of what happened. Things I wrote may have not happened in exact order, but I'd like to think I caught the essence of the chaos.
I'm glad you brought that up. It's not in the questions that I sent you, but I want to touch on that because as I was reading the book, when I do research, I have a program that I use to create timelines. And when I first started reading the book, I was trying to sort of follow the timeline and to try to put it together so that I could easily reference it back in my notes. And I realized how chaotic it was and I had to abandon it. I had to be no, instead I had to organize it by person or by, location. And so that's a really good point. That really came across in the book that it was so chaotic that morning, trying to get the order that things happened in.
Yeah, there was no way I could do it. So I just, when I do research, my head sort of turns into a mix master. I pour all the research in and then I type away like a madman and then go back and polish and, double check and everything. In just trying to approach it, there was no way I could get a straight narrative. Plus, there's so many threads going through that chaos that it made no sense to me to follow one story full and then another story full. I had to keep cutting back and forth.
Yeah. When you're covering a story like Bath, do you feel any obligation to try to understand the perpetrator's motives and understand their psychology and stuff? And if so, does that ever feel like disloyalty to the survivors to you? Because that's something that I struggle with a lot.
My goal was to not make Andrew Kehoe a monster. He was a human being, which is scarier in a way than a monster. So I had to humanize him. He did horrible things. And yet, I was talking to Josephine, she said he was nice to all his kids. Always tipped his hat, always was friendly to his kids. Meanwhile, in the bubble of his brain, whatever was being conjured up was going on. Now, you always want to get to the motivation of any crime. And I tried like hell to get myself into Kehoe's head. I wrote a confession in his hand. I threw it out. It made no sense whatsoever. And it was Looney Tunes. And then I realized I wasn't going to be able to get inside his head, which is a good thing, I think. But I had to find a way into it. And so I started looking into various studies of psychopathy. And there's something, his last name is Hare. I can't remember his first name. He more or less is expert in psychopathy and created something called the psychopathy checklist. It's sort of a gold standard. Psychopath, we think of SAW Part 37 or whatever, but it's a serious mental condition. And it could be anything from an office bully who gets a kick out of, we've all been there, to somebody who would deliberately plot to blow up a school full of children. And so he scored really high on a lot of points in the psychopathic checklist. I needed something more than just a straight scientific element. And that was, at the time, actually, this was a couple years after the Leopold and Loeb trial, if people are familiar with that, the thrill killers of Chicago. They thought they were super geniuses, and they kidnapped a boy off the streets of Chicago. They were incredibly wealthy, Leopold and Loeb, and Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. Incredibly wealthy. They picked up a kid named Bobby Franks off the street, murdered him as sort of an intellectual exercise. And they pleaded guilty after they were caught. They wanted to commit the perfect crime. Of course, they totally screwed up. And they got Clarence Darrow, the one of the most famous attorneys in the history of America. The parents, because they had money, they hired Darrow to save the boys, save Leopold and Loeb from the death penalty. And so I used Darrow's summation. I used part of it because what he talked about was, among others, he said something in the making of the man or the boy slipped. And he talked about, there's no good reason why they did this. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, but they did it. And it really summed up Kehoe as well. So I gave Darrow and the Hare book sort of my in to why he did it. And as I say in the book, ultimately, the why he took with him, other than his criminals are made not born sign that he left on his fence. The frustrating problem is there is no why. We always want, and rational people want the why. Why did he do such a thing? The story is that he was upset about his taxes. And, in the school, cost him a lot in taxes. That's nonsense. I don't like paying taxes. You don't like paying taxes. I suspect nobody in the audience likes paying taxes. But we don't go out committing mass murder as revenge for paying taxes. It was just something inside of him that this was his only way to express his anger. The why is, as I say, was blown to pieces with him, and we may never know why.
In your book, you talk about the accident that took his stepmother's life, and that after the bombing, there was speculation that he had actually caused the accident that took his stepmother's life. Do you think there's weight to that theory, or it's just no way to know?
Well, there's no way to know, but there's a lot of oddball things that happened. They had a stove. Now his father had, Kehoe's mother died, and his father remarried, and you caught me on the mistake I had with the birth year, so thanks.
I'm so embarrassed about that. Sorry.
Don't worry about it, man. Don't worry. It's funny. I thought it was funny. But his father had married a woman much younger, closer to Andrew's ballpark than, Philip Kehoe's ballpark. What happened was there was a stove that they had. It was it had a big tank on top. Now, there's different stories. One said it was gasoline, one said it was oil. But either way, be it oil or gasoline, that's going to catch fire really easy. So, she always lit the stove. I used to have a stove like that too. I would light the gas. But this morning, she lit it and the thing just roared out in flame. She was totally on fire. And Kehoe was outside. He ran in and he threw water on her. And of course, we know you don't throw water on fire because it just spreads it. You throw flour or baking powder or something like that on it.
Not flour.
Not flour? Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Flour is actually highly combustible, and it actually can explode. No flour on a fire. But baking soda is good. Salt's good.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Okay, but in any event, yeah, he threw this water on her, which made things even worse. Now, the father, at this point, he could barely walk. He was using 2 canes to get around, and he was trying to get to his wife to help her. So Kehoe went next door. They didn't have a phone in Philip Kehoe's house. And so he went next door to the neighbor, and he took his half-sister with him, who was just a child. God knows what was going through her mind. Seeing her mother, on fire like that. And he knocked on the door. He said, "Could I use your phone? Franny's been burned. She spilled hot water on her foot or something." And he said, "Sure." He said, "Oh, by the way, get a priest." And totally nonchalant. And now, did he do it? I wasn't there. You wasn't there. It's circumstantial evidence, and how much of the story is 100% true, we don't know. But he had the motivation. He had the knowledge with his deep knowledge of electricity, so he knew how to wire things and make things explode. Did he do it? I don't know. But if I were betting, I would say he would do it. He did it.
All right. Well, there you go. Now, I want to make it clear to our listeners that we're not talking about a gas stove like a modern gas stove. We're talking about a gas stove that actually used a liquid fuel tank, and that's why putting the water on it would spread it. So it wasn't in the gaseous form.
Right, exactly.
Did you ever try to track down his half-sister or her family, her descendants?
Yes, but Kehoe is such a common name, and odds are people wouldn't talk. Now, after the book came out, this is interesting, someone did contact me and said that her mother told her on her deathbed, I have something to tell you. And she said that you had an uncle, and this is what he did. We've never talked about it.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting? I left her story out of the second edition because respect her privacy, certainly. People didn't go around bragging they were, related to Andrew Kehoe. And the name is, as I said, the name Kehoe is a pretty common name, so there was no way I could track it down. And the daughter kind of slipped into the cracks of history, which is probably for the best.
Well, my next question is, every book, every author, you always have to leave some stories on the cutting room floor, just like every movie, you leave some film on the cutting room floor. So were there any details or accounts that didn't make it into your book that really stick with you?
Yeah. There was a woman who lost 3 children. And they were murdered. And she suffered so much and went through so much turmoil throughout her life. When you looked really good on your podcast, I can't remember what the term you used, but it was like tourist or something like that. I can't remember the term you used, but it was really good.
Terror tourists.
Yeah, I wish I had thought of that when I was writing. But in any event, at one point, somebody came to their door and said, I want to see the dead body. And of course, they weren't going to show it. And I thought, this woman has suffered enough. I'm not going to use her name here. And I debated using it in the updated edition. I said, no, I can't. She's suffered enough. Yeah, I mean, it was an important story, but just to show the callousness of people. But I just couldn't use her name. And I'm deliberately not using it now. People read the book, they'll figure it out. But it was just too much for me to do to her. She'd suffered.
When on the podcast, we obviously cover a lot of really, really heavy topics and heavy stories like this. And I do try to intersperse them with stories. I know it sounds crazy to say a lighthearted true crime story, because there's not really a lighthearted true crime story, but one that's less impactful. Did you ever have to stop and back away from your research for your own mental health, or just to get your mind around something that was really hard to swallow? Or
Actually, no. I just kept plowing ahead. I just stepped into writer's mode. I didn't think it bothered me. Maybe a year or two after it was out, I had a dream where I was trapped inside the rubble of a school or something like that. But my wife said to me that when I was writing the thing, my wife said that I was having nightmares, and I don't remember. Yeah, I mean, you're right about something like this. It's dead kiss. It's going to affect you. I'll tell you something. It's interesting is the wrong word. When I was really close to the end, there was a shooting at Northern Illinois University, which is maybe an hour and a half from me. And I was teaching community college English at the time. And one of my students came in the day after. It was Valentine's Day. This shooting. Basically what happened was the guy was living on Red Bulls and Twinkies for several days, and then, came into the classroom and started, pulled out a gun and just started blasting away. The morning after, one of my students walked in the classroom. She had on dark glasses and an NIU shirt. And I said, you camaraderie with your fellow students. And she said, 2 friends of mine were killed yesterday. And I said, out in the hall now. And she collapsed in my arms, just sobbing. I mean, holding a 19-year-old kid in your arms while she's sobbing because of this incomprehensible loss. It was just, I'll never forget it. And afterwards we talked, and I was close to finishing the book. And I told her the story of Josephine and how she keeps telling Ralph's story. And I said, listen, you have a duty now to tell their stories. And, they will live through you, just as, Ralph lives through Josephine. It was profound. It was a profound moment. There's a lot of moments like that. There's, as I say in the prologue, after Sandy Hook happened, after the oh my God, not again factor. But I had a friend in Connecticut who was a minister. And I emailed her. I said, hey, do you know what's going on? And she said, yeah, I live 5 miles from there. I was ministering some of the families. Right. I was a fulcrum between 2 of the worst school killings imaginable. And I called, a friend of mine in Bath. I said, hey, look, you guys know better than anyone in the world what it feels like to go through this thing. Could you write a letter expressing sympathy, and, I can pass it on. I said, of course. And they wrote a beautiful letter. And I sent it to my friend, who it was published in the local paper, is my understanding, from Sandy Hook. And my friend wrote a letter back thanking them. And as I was saying, every year there's this school luncheon. The year after Sandy Hook, this was heavy on everyone's mind. It was maybe 4 or 5 months later, it was heavy on everyone's mind. And they read the 2 letters at the luncheon, and there was not a dry eye in the house. As you can imagine, it was, like as I was saying before, you never know what's going to happen when you do these things, And that's, I think, kind of when I realized, too, that this had been my mission on Earth. I don't want to, overstate it, like I'm some sort of grandiose person. It took me a long time to take ownership of what this book did for people. I wasn't comfortable saying anything like that, but it was a moment. It was really a moment. And, I like to say, I'm kind of an honorary citizen of Bath these days, but that was a moment. There's something maybe a little more lighthearted, not really. When the book first came out, I was at a book festival, and I don't know if you remember the story of the book. Well, you did, because you talked about it on your podcast. Keo blew up his truck. He had packed it with, all kinds of nuts and bolts and shrapnel, and it hit a woman in the eye. Mrs. Peroni, who was an Italian immigrant, and everybody, loved the Peronis. But she had this sensibility not to drop her kid, not to drop the baby. She was a mother. And at this book festival, an old woman came up to me with her son, and he said, hi, nice to meet you. He said, this is my mother. She's Rosa Peroni. She was the baby.
Oh, my gosh.
You could have knocked me out, with a feather at that moment. it was one of those moments like, oh, my goodness. We took pictures together, which was nice. And she had a picture of her mom, and her mom had her head turned to the side, and she said that her mom always took pictures of that. And they asked me to sign the picture, which I can't do this. And they said, no, please. So I did. And since you can't read my signature anyway, I had to print my name beneath it. It was a profound moment, but it was also kind of a, fun's the wrong word here, like I said before, but it was a neat, kind of interesting moment that, made me feel pretty good about what the book did, for people.
Yeah, I find that for a lot of survivors that I've had the opportunity to communicate with, especially ones where I've covered their fires either in classes that I've taught or on the podcast, it becomes a cathartic thing as long as you're presenting the story from the focus of it being very victim focused and not sensationalizing it as just entertainment. And so I think that's something that both authors and true crime content producers really have been struggling with, in the past, is obviously no one's going to want to listen to the podcast or read your book if there's not some entertainment value to it. But these are people's lives, and they're not signing up to be your entertainment. And so it's a tough juggling act.
Exactly. And that was the focus of my book from the get-go, was this is about these kids who died. And that's, they are the main focus. This is their story.
So what does it take as an author to attack a project like this? It's such a big, heavy, and historically important, and it's full of trauma. Like, for anyone who's considering taking on a project like this, where do you even begin?
I never write in order, for the most part. I write, the way I look at it is history is kind of a puzzle, and all the pieces are thrown together in front of me, and I know what the picture's supposed to look like. It's just a matter of getting the pieces of the puzzle together where they fit, so that the complete picture shows. That's kind of a metaphorical way I look at how I write. So I never write in order. I'll write, the most interesting stuff from that really captures my attention, then start to fill in things. Then when I go back, I can say, oh, this is missing, that's missing. Maybe I need to move this here, move that there. It's a standard writing process for anybody. Something like this, you just kind of have to dive into it head first. If I had any trepidations, I wouldn't have done it. It's a horrifying story, to be sure, but it's one that needed to be told. And again, I don't want to sound like I'm bragging. It took me a long time to get ownership of this book, but someone told me that it was sort of the thing you never talked about in town. They kept it to themselves pretty much. But after the book came out, people started talking a little more about it and sharing it a little more with others. So I felt pretty good about that. I hope I don't come off like I'm bragging, because I'm not. This is something I'm going to carry with me the rest of my life. I've said many times, as long as I'm breathing, those kids' stories will live.
Did you run into any major roadblocks during the writing?
Well, the major roadblock, of course, was getting inside Kehoe's head, which was impossible. That was the worst thing. That was the hardest point, which is I relied on. contacted psychiatrists on, they say, "But I talked to you about this." "Oh, sure, yeah, here's my fees. There goes my advance and half my bank account." So that's why I turned to the it's not David Hare, I can't remember his name, but I turned to the Hare book and I turned to Clarence Darrow. I figured that's good enough. And that helped me get inside his head. That was the hardest thing. Also, something I didn't like that other people had said that Kehoe killed his wife. We just don't know. We don't know that he killed her. He certainly put her in a box with ritualistic precision, with the two, silver boxes on either side of her, one with silverware and things like that, the other with war bonds or money. And her skull was cracked. I don't want to get gross here, but you probably know this too. When a skull expands because of heat, or a brain expands because of heat, it cracks the skull. That could have been what happened. He could have clubbed her. He could have burned her alive. She could have died. We don't know. And so I didn't say that he killed her in the book. I couldn't do that, when all is said and done.
I agree with you. I struggled with that too, because we knew that she had been sick and in and out of the hospital leading up to it. And so, it's perfectly possible that she just died naturally. Even if the skull did crack, she could have had a seizure and fallen or something. And so I tried to make that clear in the podcast that we don't know what happened.
Yeah, and I think you did. I listened to a podcast once where they actually giggled their whole way through it and speculated on the Kehoe sex life, which really pissed me off, and read my book in really lurid fashions. And you can do that. I mean, it's, I wrote vividly, and if you read it with certain tones, it'll come off like, I always hated the title. It sounded like a 1970s sexploitation movie, but they told me in 5 words, people understand exactly what this book is about. Okay. But that was the hardest thing, was getting inside his head. That was my biggest roadblock. And of course, once being told, don't interview our survivors, and then, then it's like, how am I going to have to do this? Okay. And of course, then, that dam burst open.
Was there ever a moment during the writing where you weren't sure if you could finish it?
No, I knew I could finish it. I knew I could do it. I mean, and I had to do it. I was contracted.
That's a good motivator.
It was, yeah, it certainly is. But, and I was really caught into it. Really, I wanted to tell this story. I wanted it told right. I love forgotten stories in history. That's one of my favorite things, is to read, things that aren't necessarily remembered very well. And I've had so many people say to me, I never heard about this. Neither had I. It's known somewhat in Michigan, but it's known wider now in Michigan. But it's outside of Michigan, not a lot. It was forgotten. It was, 3 days after it happened, Charles Lindbergh took off, and it was pushed out of the headlines. It's funny because, in reading through the papers there, it was Bath, and then Lindbergh. And I think in a way that was probably the best thing that could have happened. Obviously, they didn't have the most recent school shooting, who knows? But it's in fact, they've stopped having 24-hour coverage of it because it's become a template. Just another school shooting today. But for instance, Columbine or Sandy Hook, it was nonstop and for days. And they kept showing the same footage over and over again, which is, I get killing porn or something you could call it, school murder porn. But, back then it was just, newspapers and newsreels. And the press did a good job with it. I focused on it somewhat in my book, but they didn't have that nonstop 24-hour news cycle. And I think that was a real blessing to them, because they were able to, once the terror tourists stopped, they were able to sit back and start to mourn and grieve and work with, the new reality that they were going to have to live with.
You bring up a really good point about the Lindbergh flight really sort of stealing the headlines away from this big tragedy. I think if you're looking for forgotten history tragedies, all you have to do is look around dates of major events, because back in episodes, it's either 7 and 8 or 8 and 9, I think, we covered the Sultana, which was the largest maritime disaster in U.S. history. And it happened right before they captured John Wilkes Booth, right before the assassination of Lincoln. And so it was when we covered that, I got so many messages of people that had never heard of it. And when we covered Bath, I got a bunch of messages on social media from people that are like, I live in Michigan and I didn't know this happened here. So, and I think it is really important to tell those forgotten stories. And specifically about Bath, it's kind of a forgotten tragedy, but I think there's a lot of lessons that we can tie back today to today's climate too. And I think that for that reason, it's really important to remember it.
Yeah. The one thing that we get, I mean, you can theorize all you want that, about killers and, he set the, the standard or whatever, which is nonsense. I mean, there's been mass killings throughout history. As long as when we climbed out of the slime and, started walking upright, there's been mass killings. But the one thing I found over and over again is how it draws community together and the resilience of those left behind and those in mourning and people who don't even know them. We care. We're sorry. And like I talked about the two letters, they were, between Bath and Sandy Hook. That's the one thing. I think it's not the killers, it's the survivors. That's the real thing, that the common thread you see throughout these 9/11, the outpouring of grief and sympathy and people wanting to help. Even like, if there's a house fire at somebody's house and they, burned to the ground and, people give them, food and clothing and shelter. It's that kind of tragic stuff that brings out the best. And that to me is the connection, is the real connection between Bath and Sandy Hook or 9/11 or, your neighbor's house going down in a blaze. It's goodness survives.
It does. And I think that we all have this drive to try to understand, right? Because we want to find some root cause that we can address and make things better. But I think a lot of times what we don't realize that we inadvertently do when we're trying to understand is a lot of times we do overshadow the victims and their stories. And that's where we need to keep the focus. And I know that it's something I struggle with a lot, covering true crime.
What's interesting to me, too, in Bath, they don't have any problem saying the killer's name. And I know a lot of journalism now, they don't use the killer's names because it is a different time and era. And I understand that, because, killers do it for, they want to go down in a blaze of glory or something like that. But in Bath, they don't have a problem using Kehoe's name because they want this. They remember and they don't want to erase anything, which is important. I think, initially, in your initial reporting, that's what the killer wants. But it is history, and those things do need to be told. Who did this? If there's a why? If there's no why, and a lot of times there is no why. As I said before, most people are rational, and our mind wants the why, and the why isn't always there. That to me is the real connection. Is this decency? Decency prevails.
So looking back, what do you feel most proud of or excited about or happy with that you either gained or learned or accomplished in your writing of this book?
I was able to do a full-blown narrative. I was happy about that. I'm not kidding. What the book accomplished, keeping the story alive, not letting it disappear. And, I could write a third version from all the things that I've heard since the second version. And I'm done. I'm not writing another one. Another version of this, or edition, an edition, not a version. But that I kept this story alive, that I made it human, that these weren't just, figures in a book, but these kids were real. Their lives happened. Their lives mattered. And, even Kehoe, as I said, I didn't want to make him a monster. That's too easy. It's too easy to make the killer a monster. I'm of the age, I say I'm from Chicago, but I'm of the age where John Gacy, those boys are my age. And actually I had friends in school who had lost. He murdered friends of theirs. It's tough. And, we remembered, actually I think there's going to be a Paramount or Hulu series or something about Gacy that's coming up. And this is an interesting point too. I mean, and you talked about the guy who, clipped the intestines and stuff like that. And all these terror tourists, friends were telling me that after the Gacy murder, people were driving by all the time to look at that house. And when they tore it down, people were coming up with mason jars and scooping up dirt. Souvenirs, I don't know. But what gets me is when people were walking around the remains of Kehoe's farm in the days afterwards, not knowing if there's any dynamite or anything still in the ground there. What's interesting is the farmer who owns it now, and I did not interview anybody who owns the place now. I felt that was just, I didn't want to involve anyone like that. It just wasn't, I didn't feel right about doing that. But the person who owns it now, periodically find bricks left over from the Kehoes, and he just tosses them in a ditch along the side of the road. And people periodically take them. I took one, and somebody gave me a brick from the old school too. So I had both of those. A souvenir per se, but it, sort of a talisman for me when I was writing.
In some of our earlier discussions, you were very complimentary of our coverage, and we thank you for that. But I know that you've heard versions of the story that you felt were less respectful. And so what would you want future podcasters or authors or anyone else interested in covering the Bath story to know, and what would you want them to carry forward?
First and foremost, the victims. What happened to them was horrifying, and we need to tell that it was horrifying. You can't sugarcoat this thing. Kids were torn apart, literally. There's some really gruesome stories in there, and all told to me by, an elderly victim who said, I don't want this story forgotten. Respectfully, which you guys really did it respectfully. I really liked how you did it. I've heard worse.
Well, thank you.
Much worse from other podcasts. But respect for the victims and understanding that the killer was not a monster, but a human being who was flawed in ways we can't fathom. And it's a good thing we can't fathom him too. It's, I didn't want that kind of thing in my head. Advice somebody gave me once, he said, when you're writing, be careful of what subject you choose, because that person's going to be living in your head for a year or more. So I had Keo living in my head, but I also had the victims living in my head for a year or more. That's really good advice, for somebody who's, before they attempt this, remember who's going to live in your head and take up space in your head, and you're going to be chronicling. I suppose that goes for fiction writers too, as well as true crime or biographers or what have you. And statement made an impact on me. Not that I've shied away from anything, but, my book after that was about American Nazis and the people who beat them up, which is actually coming out in a second edition next year too. I'm really thrilled about that.
Well, that leads great into my next question, which is, tell us about your other projects.
The book that I wrote about the German-American Bund, it was called Swastika Nation, Fritz Kuhn and the Rise and Fall of the German-American Bund. Went out of print for reasons I don't care to go into, but I got the rights back, and it's going to be published next year with a lot of updates to it and new information by Southern Illinois University Press, which is a really solid university press. And I did get my undergrad from there, so I think that helps. But it didn't hurt anyway, as well as that's where I met my wife. And my Civil War book about Chicago and my Carl Sandburg book are also being republished by Southern Illinois University Press. And then there's a couple of other projects, one nonfiction, one fiction that I'm goofing around with and having some fun with. And I should say too, university presses are great for authors. You won't get paid as much, but your book stays in print. Writing is a real crapshoot, as writers know. I could probably count on my hand 5 people who are friends, and I don't mean just like, how are you kind of friends, but friends. The people who answer your phone calls, who make their living at this. Maybe 5, if that. Yeah, it's about that. It's a hard business. I like to tell people I'm 25, and there's a reason I look as ugly as I do. I'm not 25, but there's a reason I have no hair. It's called genetics. But it's a hard business to be a writer. You don't get paid. Young people ask me, can I, what do I need? I want to be a writer. What should I know? I said, become a plumber. You'll get more respect, and you'll work with a lot less shit. Which is true. But it's university presses are great. They keep your book in print. They are behind you. Whereas, and I've been published by major press, and if it doesn't sell 500,000 copies in 2 weeks, they're not interested. Everybody wants the next big thing. And it's not like the old days where you'd have an editor nurture a writer through thick and thin. Now it's more, we want it, and we want it yesterday, and we want it to be bestseller yesterday kind of thing. And of course, Kindle and self-publishing changed everything, and now AI is really changing everything. Book scraping there was a suit against, which was won. The Authors Guild, which I'm a member, was one of the people involved in the suit. People's books getting scraped was the term, being, taken and used to train AI. And I found 3 of my works there, and many, many, many people I know. And there was a huge lawsuit that was settled. I can't remember what the settlement was. It was significant, and I'll probably see a few bucks out of it myself. But given that it has to be spread across so many people, it won't be enough to, buy a new house kind of settlement. Probably more like, getting a couple cups of coffee. But it's funny because I did write into, I can't remember if it was ChatGPT or whatever, write like me, write a story like me. And it kind of had my style. It sort of sounded like me, but it was missing the human factor. It was missing the DNA. So AI It has its uses that are very good, but it's HAL 9000's grandchild, and we all know what HAL 9000 did. So and for those of you who don't know, watch 2001: A Space Odyssey and you'll get the joke. But those are many factors that are affecting the industry right now. And with the big name publishers, I would say, university presses are great. If people want to get started, it's a good place to start. University of Michigan Press published my book, and it's been in print for quite some time. And I have a great relationship with them. And, my other books are going to be republished by another university press. And we have a good relationship. I like it a lot. I have to do other things, obviously, to, put bread on the table and pay the mortgage. But, I teach, I do some ghostwriting, things like that, marketing, speeching, I kind of flap things together sometimes. It's feast and famine world out here. To me, these books are going to be my legacy. I like to imagine years from now somebody finding one of my books in a used bookstore long after I've dropped dead and saying, hey, this looks interesting, picking it up and reading. And that, I think, is going to be my legacy. I've made my mark on the world this way.
Yes, you certainly have. Now, you, on your website, you do offer upcoming authors and people that are working on their writing consulting services. Is that something you want to talk about in the podcast?
Sure, why not? Yeah, I do editing, I do writing coaching, I do ghostwriting, and I've worked with a lot of interesting people as a result of this. Some big names that I cannot say, and people who want to write a family memoir or something, or a business history or things like that. If your listeners want to contact me, I'd be happy to talk with them, and even if they would want to talk book stuff with me and have questions about the books. I'm not hard to find on the internet, of course, but if you go to arniebernstein.com, ARNIEBERNSTEIN.com. There's a bazillion ways to find me there and to contact me, and I'm happy to talk to people. And if people want to hire me, I'm even happier.
And you have a Substack.
Yes, I do. The Typewriter's Collage, which is a little more goofy. I do have some serious pieces on it and some reflective pieces. I also have a lot of goofy things on it. It's a nice outlet. I write on typewriters. I have a really healthy stable of typewriters. I use manuals. That's how I learned to type, was on a typewriter. And after I went to computers, there's something that was missing. And then we have in Chicago, it's wonderful. It's called the American Writers Museum, devoted to writing. It's such a great museum. But they had a typewriter bank, and I jumped on it immediately and just started pounding away. I thought, oh my God, I missed this so much. And so I started buying typewriters again. And I read all my first drafts on typewriters. There's no distractions, certainly. It's just me and the words. Typewriters are meant for one thing and one thing only, writing. And it's really easy. I just, I type and I scan the sheets in to Google Docs, reformat it, and, and then edit. And it's my version of Hemingway's dictum, write drunk, edit sober. Because when I typewrite, I just let the ideas fly. Whereas in the computer, I can be a little more slow. And I edit the same way. I print it out and mark it up. Do not, and this is my good advice for writers, proof off a hard copy, edit off hard copy. Don't do it off the computer. Our eyes and our brains, and I'm falling in my teacher lecture mode here, are designed to look for natural borders. So that's why our eyes glaze over when we're on computers, reading something on computer, as opposed to read something on paper. And we're more engaged when we read books, when we read magazines, newspapers, reports, whatever, than if we were reading them on a Kindle or laptop or whatever. I encourage people to take up with typewriters too. They're in now, I guess, too. They're retro. But I know I love writing on typewriters. And so that's why I call my thing the Typewriter's Collage. And people, feel free to subscribe. It's actually free. There's no charge other, but if you want to buy me a coffee, that link is there. Throw something in the tip jar. And lots of references to Chico Marx. I'm a huge Marx Brothers fan, but there's lots of references to Chico. Not so much to Groucho and Harpo and Zeppo. Go figure.
I am a subscriber to your Substack.
Oh, thank you.
I very much enjoyed catching up a little bit on what you had up there, and saw your pictures of typewriters. And I came along when we were all using electric typewriters, so using a typewriter, from my nostalgia, doesn't feel that different than using a computer keyboard to me. But I can imagine that if you had the history of using the more manual ones, that would feel really different.
Yeah, oh my God, I learned on a Royal Upright. I have a story about that on my Substack, if people want to find it, about the typing teacher who was surprised that I didn't take it as a blow-off class. I wanted it more than driver's ed. I wanted to learn to type. And I'm very geeky about my typewriters. I'm actually doing a major repair, my first major repair on a typewriter. I'm very excited.
As an engineer, I can get behind that.
Yeah, there you go. But, and what do I have? Like maybe 4 or 5. I can't even remember now. And there's one waiting for me in Michigan. One of my friends now, because of Bath, found a really nice typewriter for me. And like I said, actually, it's the daughter of one of my friends from Bath. We're that close. It's my Michigan home and my Michigan family.
I have just very much enjoyed having this conversation with you. I was so honored that you thought enough of our coverage to even reach out. And so thank you so much for making the time for us. We very much enjoyed having you.
Oh, no, I'm glad to have done it. As I said before, a lot of people just don't do this story justice. And you guys just did a real bang-up job. It was sensitive to the victims, not, drawing back from the killer. You balanced the stories, and you presented it in a nice, even manner. You weren't joking your way through it like others have. And it was respectful. It was really respectful and well done. I re-listened to both those episodes today in preparation for this. And again, I thought, this is really good. So I'll save them on my iPhone.
Well, thank you so much for the compliment, because that really means a lot. I am an engineer and not a writer.
Yeah, I'm available if you want to coach. Fun. I had a blast here. This was a lot of fun.
This has been great fun, and I hope that we stay in touch.
Oh, please do. Please do.
I will link to your website and to your Substack in the show notes, so if anyone is looking for you, they know exactly where to find you.
Bless your heart. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Crime to Burn is a production of Crime to Burn, LLC, where we light fires in your brain and not your buildings. All rights reserved.